You got Deuteronomy? I remember when I was a teenager, it was not long after I got saved, the pastor had recruited me to help with the kids program on Wednesday nights. They did King's Kid. No, it was Masters Clubs. And one of the things that we did every week with the kids is we started going through the books of the Bible with them so they could learn it. Well, there was this one kid that he kind of annoyed me. He had that, and he's just a little kid. It's terrible. I mean, I was a teenager, and so little kids annoyed me anyway. But he kind of had this aura about him, kind of like a Richie Rich type kid. He wasn't, but he just kind of had that aura and the white turtleneck and hair. It's crazy because I can picture him right there. This has been a while. And I was going through the books of the Bible with him. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and he would always say, Deuteronomy. I said, no, it's Deuteronomy. Okay, let's try again. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy. Say Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. No, Deuteronomy. Say Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. Well, say it. I can't say it. Well, let's try this. Deuteronomy. Onomy. Okay, now say it together. Deuteronomy. It's just like, why? All right, so we're going to be starting out Deuteronomy. Let me see here. 17. Yeah, 17. Deuteronomy 17. Let's pray, and we'll get started. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. And thank you for this opportunity to study your word together. Help us to better understand your word, in particular this book. And there's some very fascinating things that are coming up in Deuteronomy. Pray that you'd help us to appreciate it, to understand it, see how this applies to our life. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so chapter 17. We've been slowly working our way up, much slower pace than what I anticipated. And Deuteronomy is basically 3 sermons, Moses' last 3 messages to the children of Israel. And they're kind of a farewell address, but he's trying to remind the children of Israel, the second generation, before they go into the promised land, he's reminding them of the law. He's kind of laying it back down. So in his first sermon, in chapters 1 through 4, he's reminding them of what Israel did in the past. Let's see here. Would you like one of these to follow along? There you go. And so the first sermon that he does is reminding them of their history. He reminds them of God's deliverance, how he brought them out of Egypt, and then the travels that they had over these 40 years. In the second sermon, which is where we're trying to finish up, he's explaining to them the law. He reestablishes the law and the 10 Commandments, and he begins to show the various avenues in which we apply that law. And at the beginning of the sermon, I guess you could kind of say his first point in chapters 5 through 11, he's explaining, well, not 5 to 11, 5 to 11. He's explaining that the basis of the law is love. That is fundamentally what is at the very bottom level is love. And what is supposed to happen is our love for God and our love for one another is then supposed to extend into our keeping of the commandments of God. And now we're working on this second point of his sermon, chapters 12 through 25, on page 2 here. And what he's doing here in his second point is he is explaining how the law is to be applied. And as we noted, he applies 10 Commandments to specific situations. He gives examples of how the Ten Commandments apply in daily life. And they include consecration, apostasy, judicial matters, governmental righteousness, the guarantees of justice, the authority of the sanctuary in the home, so the relationship of individual homes to the worship of God, the sanctity of the divine order, including labor, marriage, the congregation, the protection for the weak, the sanctity of individual life. So those are things that he's beginning to address. So it's not just a matter of thou shalt not kill, but he's getting into why. Because people are made in the image of God. Life has value, so you don't kill. Or at least you don't take it into your own hands. There's obviously, that doesn't extend to capital punishment and war and things like that. Now, we did have a few examples here. There was the matter of personal disputes that he lists in chapter 17, verses 8 to 13. And what he does in chapter 17 here, let's look, verse 8. If there arise a matter too hard for thee in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within thy gates, then shalt thou arise and get thee up into the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. So that's the place where the tabernacle is going to be set up. As thou shalt come unto the priest, the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire, that they shall show thee the sentence of judgment. And thou shalt do according to the sentence, which they of the place, which the Lord shall choose, shall show thee. And thou shalt observe to do according to all that they inform thee. So, what he's saying here is, you have a couple guys, and they have a dispute that they can't settle on their own. They don't need to go out to the Gentiles. It's kind of the same principle as 1 Corinthians chapter 6. When there's matters of personal dispute, you don't need to go to law with them. You don't need to go to the Gentiles. You don't need to go to the lost world to handle it. What you do is, in essence, you bring it to the church. You bring it to the church and allow the church to kind of mediate this thing and figure out, and then settle a judgment on this matter of the personal dispute. That's exactly what he's telling the children of Israel to do. If you have a matter a personal dispute that you can't settle, then what you do is you go to the tabernacle, you go to the priest and to the judge there, and you allow the priest then to settle the dispute, and you go by what they say. And that principle extends right over into the New Testament. He then lists, after that, in verse number 14, he speaks of the fact that they will have a king, a future king. When thou art come into the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. Okay, so here we see God is anticipating they're going to want a king, and God is anticipating, I'm going to set up a king for them. Now, that is his plan. Now, obviously, they kind of jumped the gun on it. They came a little early because David should have been, and I think was God's plan for the first king of Israel, but they jumped the gun and got Saul. Now, Saul was going to be out eventually anyway, because Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamites aren't supposed to be kings anyhow. They're not a ruling tribe. Judah is the ruling tribe, and David is from Judah. But they're going to have a king, and so now he gives some instruction regarding this king. So you're going to, whom the Lord shall choose, one from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, or a foreigner, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt. So the multiplying of horses to himself, that has to do with war. He's not supposed to just kind of be building up his army and his military power. And the reason for that is because you're not supposed to trust in horses. You're not supposed to trust in men. We're supposed to trust in the Lord. And that's what the king was supposed to do. Nor cause people to return to Egypt. To the end, he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself. Well, I don't think there was any king in Israel that followed that commandment, is there? Pretty much all of them had multiple wives and then a bunch of other concubines. That his heart turn not away. That's exactly what happens to Solomon. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver or gold. And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of the law in a book out of that which is before the priest, the Levite. So he's supposed to have his own copy of God's law. Now, whether that means all 5 books of Moses or if that just means the book of Deuteronomy, I'm not 100% sure. It might go either way. But what's he saying? He says when that king comes to the throne, he's supposed to be a scribe and a scholar of the Scriptures. That man needs to know the book inside and out because he's going to be leading the nation and judging for the nation, and so he needs to know God's judgment on that matter. And it shall be with him, verse 19, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So, they're going to have a king. Then, chapter 18, he speaks about false teachers. So, down to verse number 9 in chapter 18. This isn't about a specific teacher, but notice he says, when thou art come to the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of the nations. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times. So that would be like an astrologer, kind of how we would word that today. Or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits. You know, the psychics. That's kind of what that is. Or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination. So he says you're supposed to eliminate that type of influence from you. Get down to verse number 15. Before verse 15. Go down to verse 20. It says, but the prophet which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even that prophet shall die. So he's warning against false prophets. Now, it's fascinating, I think, here, because right in the middle of this, he talked about the king in chapter 17. Chapter 18, he's talking about false prophets. But then right in the midst of that, notice here, verse 15, the Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him shall ye hearken. Then drop down, verse number 15. Oh, that's where I was. Let me just keep reading then. According to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. And the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken that they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Now, that's a prophecy of Jesus. We saw that week before last, John chapter 1, John chapter 6. People, as they hear Jesus, they're beginning to see he is that prophet that Moses foretold of. And it's interesting because when Moses describes the false prophet right after this, the prophet that will presume to speak in his own name, Jesus on a number of occasions says, I am not come in my own name. I am come in my Father's name. And so if you hear my words, you're hearing the Father's words. And what's Jesus doing? He's referring right back to this very principle here. So now, in the second sermon, notice down here at the bottom of page 2, in the second sermon, Moses is making the application of the Ten Commandments. He shows how they apply in various areas of life. When we know the specific situations, we can then take the principles and apply them to every other area of life. So in Psalm 119, for instance, where it mentions the precepts of the Lord, that's what this is talking about, the principles of the law. So, for instance, we have the command, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Okay, well, that's a very specific command. If you have the ox and he's out and he's pulling the stone over the wheat to crush it and to get the chaff off of it, you're not supposed to forbid him from eating some of that wheat while he's grinding it. Well, is that only talking about feeding oxen and the labor of oxen? Well, Paul makes it clear, Jesus makes it clear, when he applies it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, that thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn, is also applicable to those who minister the gospel or to live of the gospel. The laborer, Paul says, is worthy of his reward. So if you have a paradigm, you have a set of principles, you have a laborer, you have and that laborer then is supposed to be a partaker of his labors. And so, not just the ox, but anybody that's a servant, you feed and you provide for the servant. You have an employee, you feed and provide for the employee. This is a principle that applies across. You have these precepts. Then in chapter 26, let's jump ahead, get to the end of this book finally. Chapter 26, we have some covenant reminders. And this deals with the feasts, the tithes of the people when they get into the land. And they're a reminder of the covenant. But I want you to notice here, jump down to verse number 16. I want you to see how he closes this sermon. Verse number 16, this day the Lord thy God hath commanded thee to do these statutes and judgments. Thou shalt therefore keep and do them with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Thou hast avouched the Lord thy God, the Lord this day to be thy God, and to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes and his commandments, and his judgments, and to hearken unto his voice. And the Lord hath avouched thee this day to be his peculiar people, as he hath promised thee, and that thou shouldest keep all his commandments, to make thee high above all nations which he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor, and that thou mayest be an holy people unto the Lord thy God, as he hath spoken. So what's going on here is there's a covenant renewal. In essence, at this point, God is entering into covenant with this second generation. They are swearing by God that we are going to love God, we're going to follow him and obey him, and God is swearing to them, I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to uphold my end of this covenant as well. So he's entering back into covenant with them. Now, chapter 27 begins the third sermon. And in this third sermon, we have the future of Israel. And let's just read here a little bit. So this section deals with the prescriptions of covenant renewal. They're going to renew the covenant. They're going to have a public ceremony for this once they get into the land. Chapter 27, verses 1 to 13. Moses, notice here verse 1, Moses with the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you this day. And it shall be on the day when ye shall pass over Jordan unto the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt set thee up great stones, and plaster them with plaster, and thou shalt write upon them all the words of this law when thou art passed over, that thou mayest go in unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, a land that floweth with milk and honey, as the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee. Therefore it shall be, when ye be gone over Jordan, that ye shall set up these stones which I command you this day in Mount Ebal, and thou shalt plaster them with plaster. And there shalt thou build an altar unto the Lord thy God, an altar of stones. Thou shalt not lift up any iron tool upon them. Thou shalt build the altar of the Lord thy God of whole stones. Thou shalt offer burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt offer peace offerings, and shalt eat there, and rejoice before the Lord thy God. And thou shalt write upon the stones all the words of this law very plainly. And Moses and the priests, the Levites, spake unto all people, saying, take heed and hearken, O Israel, this day thou art become the people of the Lord thy God. Thou shalt therefore obey the voice of the Lord thy God, and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. And Moses charged the people the same day, saying, these shall stand upon Mount Gerizim to bless the people when ye come over Jordan, Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar and Joseph and Benjamin. And these shall stand upon Mount Ebal to curse Reuben, Gad, Asher, and Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. So, once they get in the land, they're going to have two large hills, two mounts, over against each other. Elders from each of the tribes are going to ascend those two mountains, and they're going to proclaim to one side to the other the blessings and the cursings of the law. So notice here, from Ebal, Mount Ebal, the laws were read one at a time, with the curses for disobedience, and the people were to say amen. The same was declared, the same law was declared from Mount Gerizim along with the declaration of blessings. So on one side they're going to proclaim the commandments of God and the curses for disobedience. On the other side, they're going to proclaim over to the other side the same laws, but with the blessings for obedience. And the people are going to say amen. They're entering into agreement on the terms of the covenant. Now what's interesting is who's on each mountain. Because Moses assigns the children of Leah and Rachel to the mountain of blessing. Now, Leah and Rachel, what's unique about them? Anybody? They're the legitimate wives of Jacob. He had two kind of concubines, I guess you could say. And so their children are going to be on the other side to proclaim the curses. Very interesting how he sets this up. So notice here down in chapter 28, in your notes here. Chapter 28, verse 1 to 14, record the blessing for faithfulness to the covenant. And chapter 25, verses 15 to 68, record the curses for forsaking the covenant. Now, as it starts out, look over to chapter 28. So as it starts out fairly mild, comparatively speaking. Because, let's see here, verse 15, he says, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Curses shalt thou be in the city, curses shalt thou be in the field, curses shall be thy basket and thy store, curses shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kind, and the flocks of thy sheep." So he's starting out, basically, you're not going to be successful in anything that you do. Nothing you do in the city is going to prosper. Nothing you do in your home is going to prosper. In fact, you're not even going to be able to store up grain. It's going to mildew. Mice are going to get into it and eat it. The bugs are going to get in there. It's not going to be protected. You're going to have miscarrying wombs. Now, for us, that sounds pretty detrimental, but it's mild compared to what comes at the end. And as long as they continue to disobey God, those curses are going to progressively get worse and worse. If you drop down to verse number 49, it's going to get really bad here. Verse 49, "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which thou shalt not regard the person, the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, fruit of thy land, which until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or the flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And thou," now notice how bad this is. "And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness wherein thine enemies shall distress thee." Now Jeremiah records that this actually takes place. When Babylon comes up and they circle the city of Jerusalem and they besiege it for months, and there's nobody coming in, nobody going out, their food runs out. And so the people go crazy. And they begin to have conversations like this. The ladies sit down and they have conversations like this. "Today we'll eat my son, and tomorrow we'll eat yours." I can't even fathom that type of a thought going through my mind, much less actually verbalizing that to somebody else. But that just shows how terrible of a spot they're in. And so they're going to be besieged. They're going to be, notice what he says, you're going to eat your children. And then come down here, verse 58, "If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, and the great plagues, and the long continuance, and sore sickness, and a long continuance. Moreover, he shall bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also, every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord thy Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. And ye shall be left few in number, whereas ye were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldest not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught, and ye shall be plucked from off the land whereon thou goest, whither thou goest to possess it. Verse 64, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. He says, and among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee their trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee. And thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again, and there shall ye be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. So it's going to get pretty bad. If you don't obey the covenant, he says, I'm going to kick you out of the land. In fact, you're going to pretty much be destroyed. He says, you were as the stars of heaven. You were as the sand on the seashore. But if you disobey the covenant, you're going to be left few in number. Well, that has certainly come to pass, has it not? One of the smallest nations in the world today is Israel. 15 million Jews. That's not very many. It's only by God's grace and His love for the people that they still exist today. And 2/3 of them are going to be killed during the tribulation period. So there's not going to be too many Jews left at the very end of this thing. Now, we get over into chapter 30, and God makes it clear that He is not through with the nation of Israel. All these things are going to happen. It happened when the northern kingdom of Israel was dispersed by Assyria and kicked out of the land and kind of assimilated into the people and essentially disappeared. But then the southern kingdom of Judah later then was taken into Babylonian captivity, and since then they've always been dispersed. But even after the time of Christ, they rejected their Messiah. 40 years later, in 70 A.D., Titus comes along, destroys the city. Jews are dispersed again, and they're still in dispersion today as a result of that. Does that mean then that God is done with the nation of Israel? No, it certainly doesn't. Notice chapter 30, verse 1. And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations, whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee. Thou shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey His voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart, with all thy soul. Then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity. Now watch the wording here. He'll turn thy captivity and have compassion on thee, and will what? Return. Now that's really interesting. In order for Him to return, what does that mean has to take place prior to that? Well, He had to leave, which means He had to be here to begin with. So this is looking forward to the second coming of Christ. Because in the first coming, the first advent, Jesus came, God manifested in the flesh, and He came to the earth, and then He left. But He's coming back. And Jesus is going to refer to this. I'll show you here in just a moment. He says, will return and will gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee, If any of thine be driven out from, now watch the wording, from the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it. And he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine heart. That's talking about regeneration, salvation. And the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. Sorry, I lost my spot here. All thine heart, with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. Lord thy God will put all these curses upon thine enemies, and on them that hate thee, which persecuted thee. And the Lord and thou shalt return and obey the voice of the Lord, and do all his commandments which I command thee this day. And the Lord thy God will make thee plenteous in every work of thine hands, in the fruit of thy body, in the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy land, for good. For the Lord will again rejoice over thee for good, as he rejoiced over thy fathers. So notice he says, I'm going to return, I'm going to gather you. You're going to be scattered to all the nations, but I'm going to come back, and I'm going to gather you all back. Well, how does that take place? Keep your place here. We're going to come back and finish this up real quick in just a second. Go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is where Jesus is describing the events, or kind of giving a summary, the events of the day of the Lord. Which is the 70th week of Daniel, the future tribulation period. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to drop down here to verse number 29. Verse 29 is at the end of the tribulation. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, verse 31, watch this. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. That's what Moses is referring to back here in Deuteronomy chapter 30. How is he going to gather Israel that's been scattered to the nations? How is he going to gather them back? He's going to come, when he comes back, when he returns, he's going to dispatch his angels, and they're going to gather up the Jews that are remaining, and he's going to bring them into the promised land just exactly as he promised. Now, let's finish up here real quick. Point number 2 of his final message is in chapters 31 to 34, and this is the preparations for the transition from Moses to Joshua. So this is the new leader. But what I want to do is I want to take you to the end, to the very end, the last paragraph. Remember, we noticed a couple moments ago in chapter 18, Moses makes mention of the fact that the Lord is going to raise up a prophet like me from among your brethren. Now, we have a statement about that. That's how the book of Deuteronomy is going to close, is with that thought in mind. Notice chapter 34, verse 5. So this is where Moses is going to die. Notice, so Moses, servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre, notice this phrase, unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural force abated, so he still young and spry. And the children of Israel wept for Moses at the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. Now notice verse 10. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land. And in all that mighty hand, and in all that great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel. Now this is interesting. This is important. Here, let's think about this for a moment. So he says, there's never been a prophet like Moses. Obviously until Jesus, because that's who it's referring to. Now here's the question. Who wrote verses 5 to 12? Because we know, in general, Moses wrote Deuteronomy, or at least he spoke it, and maybe somebody transcribed it, but it's attributed to him. But who wrote verses 5 to 12? Now, what I grew up with, I remember when I was a teenager hearing, and you kind of grow up and you hear something and you just trust the pastor for what he's saying. Well, he said, Moses wrote this, and God was telling him ahead of time what was going to happen. That sounds good, and I guess it's a possibility, but the wording doesn't make sense for that. Because you have a couple of expressions here. One is in verse 6. At the end of verse 6, he says, unto this day. He says, nobody knows where the sepulcher, the tomb of Moses is, until this day. Which means that whoever's saying that is sometime long after Moses' death and burial. Another thing, if you drop down to verse number 10, when he says, there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So he's saying there's never been another prophet like Moses. How would you be able to evaluate that? You would have to have had a long list of prophets go before and be at the very end of the prophets. Well, when does that take place? That takes place at the time of Zechariah and Malachi. They were the last two of the Old Testament prophets. So whoever wrote at least this section from verse 9 through verse 12 had to have lived at the time of Nehemiah in order to be able to write that. So what we have here, and we'll notice this several times as we go through the Old Testament, where a book is written, but then later on somebody comes in, especially after the captivity, after they return back with Nehemiah and Ezra, and they, as they're writing, making new copies of the law, God inspires them to add these additional details at the end. Not necessarily a big deal. I think it's interesting, worthy of note. So, any questions, thoughts, comments on any of that? Okay? All right, you're dismissed.